Thanks, Angela. Well, good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a good Friday so far. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about herbicides, mostly about grass ID, and I'm going to end with some harvest dates to think about in corn. One of the first things I thought I would share with you all, it's kind of a reminder. I think a lot of you probably know it, but it is a little bit of a reminder. Is we had a lot of pretty late planted soybeans this year, which isn't uncommon, but it seemed like this year we had some very late, in some cases, well into July. And prefix has been very cheap. We've seen a lot of later applications, or we have seen some at least, applications of herbicides that contain permethrin, like Prefix or FlexStar or Reflex. And there's some generic ones out there as well. Let's see. And so this just kind of a picture. Actually, this was a call we ran several years ago in Dyer County, back in 2012, I guess is what I got on the screen. But those rows on your left had an application, a late application of FlexStar, and the rows on the right did not, the year previous. So that recrop can be a real issue back from a corn, particularly, or even a grain sorghum, even more so after a late permethrin application. Then often it won't be, but at times it can be. And I just kind of want to do a little reminder: 10-month recrop after a permethrin application to corn, 18-month plant back to grain sorghum after corn. And you start looking at like a July application of, say, a reflex product. I have to use my fingers here, but you've got August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April. So you're really into May before you could, and well into May before you could safely plant corn after a permethrin application if it was back in July. So that is something to keep mind of as you're talking to some of your growers out there, and they're starting to think about putting crops on fields next year. One of the questions is, what herbicide did you use on some of those later planted soybean fields? If it's a permethrin-based product, they may want to reconsider going to corn on that field. They might be better off with cotton. Or if they are going to plant corn, don't rush out and plant that one first. Make it later in the field. Weather conditions can have a big impact on how persistent permethrin is. So if you're in an area that's been pretty dry, like we have here at the station this year during the summer months, it's more likely to be a problem. Wet summers will degrade it very quickly. It really doesn't matter what it does in the winter because it's so cold, the ground's so cold that you just don't see much breakdown of it. So August, September, October, while the soils are still fairly warm, if it's wet, you're probably not going to have a problem. But if you have a pretty good dry spell in there, there's a real chance you'll see that reflex bite the corn the next year if you're inside that 10-month window. So just something that keep mind of, kind of a reminder, because I know a lot of you do know that. One of the questions I often get, and I think maybe some of y'all do too, is atrazine and how long it lasts in the soil as far as giving weed control. And this was a study done, this again several years ago, that Tom Mueller put together, where Philip Shelby and Tim Campbell, they pulled soil out of some cornfields and sent to him. And then he pulled some soil, Philip did, out of a CRP ground that hadn't seen atrazine in decades. So what he did then is, he took him to Knoxville and he ran through the HPLC, and he determined how long atrazine persisted in the soil on those soils that had been collected either out of the cornfield that year or out of a CRP. And this is the first slide. So this is out of the CRP ground. On your x-axis there, you have days after treatment of atrazine at a pound. And on your y-axis there, you have parts per billion of atrazine that he detected in the soil. And to be herbicidally active and give us some weed control, you need to be roughly about 1,000, a little better, 1,000 parts per billion. And you can see even at 20 days after application, there was enough atrazine in that soil present to give some weed control. All right. Now compare that to the other Gibson County location. Oh, he's persistently calling me. I'll hang up again. Another Gibson County location where this was a soil that Philip pulled out of a cornfield that year. All right. And Tom put his atrazine on it, and this is again looking at measuring how long atrazine is persistent in the soil. And look at how quickly that curve drops off down to zero. So actually less than 10 days, well less than 10 days, about 3 or 4 days, that herbicide, enough has been degraded that it's no longer herbicidally active. And this is something we found time and again. So you look at cornfield pulled out of Dyer County that Tim Campbell had pulled, very same curve where it just drops off the earth here. Another Dyer County location. So what's happening here is microbes build up in the soil the year that you put atrazine on there, and these microbes build up that basically eat atrazine. They break it down to where it isn't herbicidally active, and you get those microbes built up in the soil. So even though you go out there the next year and put atrazine on, you're basically not going to get any residual activity out of it. That's pretty much rest assured. It's still a very effective post option. You know, atrazine and Roundup post-emergence over the top, still very effective, but don't expect it to bring a lot to the table from a residual standpoint. The other question you get from this data, well, what about if I use metribuzin, another triazine, in my soybeans next year? Will it affect it? It doesn't seem to. Metribuzin seems to still give us good activity. So those microbes are very specific to atrazine. They're not really affecting metribuzin per se, another triazine. So I thought this was some interesting data. I know I presented some of this in the past. But this just kind of reaffirms when folks are starting to structure their weed control and thinking they're going to lean on atrazine to give them a lot of residual control. It really depends. If the field hasn't seen atrazine for several years, yeah, it will give you some decent residual. If atrazine has been used in that cornfield or in that field in previous years, you know, within the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, it probably isn't going to give you much residual control. So with that, I'm going to just kind of jump. But this was a survey, and you all have seen this. I've shown this all last fall. This was we went out and just surveyed a lot of basically soybean fields and a few cotton fields and tried to get a feel for what we were seeing out there as far as weeds that are missing. This is pretty easy to do from the soybean and cotton field. We've already started doing some of that this year in some fields. But it's hard to do in corn. You can't see the weeds, right? They're just, they hide out all the weeds, but they're there. Typically after harvest is when you start to see them. One thing I wanted to point out there is even in these soybean and cotton fields, where we can use clethodim, we can use Fusilade, we can use Roundup very regularly, we found, you know, in better than 10 out of every field's a significant Johnson grass issue. It's even more so in corn. In fact, that's where it really gets its feet under it. And really, Johnson grass is becoming more and more of an issue in our corn crop because of that. We've seen that early on in burn downs. This is Johnson grass escaping a glyphosate burn down. This is actually a spot I think that Heather had out here in Madison County a few years ago where Roundup just did not do a good job on burn down. And then you get it right into your corn. Even prior to this, though, we did a bunch of, this is probably about 7, 8 years ago now, we did a fairly significant survey of Johnson grass populations, and we found we have a number of populations out here that are glyphosate resistant, and it's increasingly becoming a problem. Even at 22 ounces is standard rate, we're seeing a difference, but even up to 88 ounces, 4x rate, we're seeing these Johnson grass populations have some decent tolerance. Now, Johnson grass doesn't spread as rapidly as a lot of our annual weeds do, like Palmer pigweed or goosegrass, because it just does not produce a lot of seed. It mostly reproduces via rhizome, so that's a more slower spread, but it seems like it's getting a critical tipping point in a number of counties. It kind of got started in Shelby, Tipton County, but it's progressively now moved into some other counties, clear here to Madison County now. And it's not uncommon most every spring for us to get calls like this where folks go out number one herbicide used in Tennessee is Halix GT. Glyphosate is typically been a very good, effective Johnson grass herbicide, but not where we've got the resistant biotype. So the question is, now what do we do? And so some of the things we did this past year is kind of went old school and looked at the herbicides we used back in the 80s on corn for Johnson grass. And this was some stuff we just did here on the station on a site that's pretty glyphosate resistant. We have here just at Jackson. And going back to old Steadfast. Steadfast and atrazine was the number one herbicide used here in Tennessee 15 years ago. And it still works on Johnson grass. That's basically what we found. Compared that to Halix GT that's on the right, when you have a glyphosate resistant version of it, it's just not going to help. It's going to have an ALS inhibitor in there of some sort. Steadfast Q would be one. Accent Q would be another. We looked at Caprino. It does have an SU in there. That SU does help, but it isn't as good as Steadfast Q or Accent Q. Steadfast Q, Accent Q, we're getting, a good, 90+% control. Caprino, it starts off pretty well, but we do see a little bit more regrowth out of it. It's probably closer to 80% control, maybe a little less, depending on how well established that Johnson grass is. So just something to think about on kind of the newer problem weed we're having in corn lately. And again, it's getting back to that old nemesis of us, glyphosate-resistant biotype development. So with that, I think I'll talk a little bit about identification of some of the grass species. Again, some of this I think is old hat with some of you, but maybe a refresher for most folks. And most folks can identify broadleaves pretty well, but I think we all struggle, including myself, with grasses, especially when they're small. And one of the best places to look for them, and when they're small, a hand lens certainly will help, is down around the collar region where the leaf meets the stem of the grass. And there you're going to see some different traits that these different grasses will have. And just some of the fundamentals here, they all have a blade, the leaf blade. A lot of times, sometimes they'll have a very prominent midvein, and some grasses will not. And that's one way to identify them. Another very key way, again, is where the leaf meets the stem is the ligule right here. This can tell you a lot. This is one of the best ways to distinguish grasses, particularly early, before they head out, which is when we really need to know what they are so we can spray an effective herbicide on them. And that's a ligule. And the ligule sometimes will be membranous, like what you see here, which membranous is just basically a little leaf tissue, is what it looks like, just a small little leaf sticking up. Sometimes it'll be hairy. Sometimes it won't be present at all. And that will tell you right then that you have a particular grass. Another thing is these auricles, which is kind of the leaf kind of reaching around like little arms around the backside of the stem. There's basically, you're all familiar with one thing that has, one grass species that has auricles, and that's wheat. Wheat has auricles, but ryegrass does too. And if you see these auricles around the leaf stem, there's a good chance you're looking at ryegrass. A lot of times the sheath can be folded or not. That's kind of the leaf as it goes down and wraps around the stem further down from where the leaf attaches. And the sheath margin, sometimes you can have hair, sometimes they don't. The other thing is it flat? Is that stem flat or is it round? That can be a distinction characteristic. So again, the ligule is one of the best ways to tell apart different grasses. Some will have no ligule on them. There's actually only really two species that we have to worry about here in Tennessee that have no ligule, and that's barnyard grass and its close cousin jungle rice. Some will have membranous ligules. Johnson grass would be a very good example of this. Crabgrass, that's another very good example of a grass that has a membranous ligule. Some will have more of a hairy, fringed with hairs at the ligule. A lot of the foxtail species will have that. Fall panicum will have that as well. So that's one thing to look at with those. Now to get some kind of real world picture. So here's Johnson grass. I think we all know it's rhizomous, so a lot of times it comes up in clumps where those rhizomes are. If you pull that leaf back from the stem, you're going to see that membranous ligule. Pretty much dead giveaway, you have Johnson grass. Another thing you'll see is it has a very prominent midvein. Fall panicum is another grass. It has a very prominent midbrain, and at first glance, if it's not in a big clump like you see here, you can almost think, well, you can mistake Johnson grass for fall panicum, because fall panicum is not an annual. The fall panicum will not have a membranous ligule. It will have a hairy one. Barnyard grass, which is the opposite extreme. You pull it back, it has no ligule at all. You don't see anything there. That's one of the best ways to key out barnyard grass, jungle rice, from a lot of the other grass species we typically struggle with. The other thing you'll often see with it is it will have a red base, a red or purplish base, which is pretty characteristic of barnyard grass. There's one other grass that's pretty common that will have a red base. And early on, even I do this for a living, but even I can struggle trying to tell it apart when you're looking at it early, is broadleaf signal grass will also have a red base. So that it can kind of be a little tricky, but if it doesn't have a ligule, it's barnyard grass. If it does have a ligule, broadleaf signal grass. Typical good rule of thumb. Here's barnyard grass. This is, look at the red stems here. Very, very key giveaway early on when you're trying to identify these. If you see this red stem, it's basically going to be one of two grasses, primarily broadleaf signal grass again, or jungle rice. Again, look at the ligule. It has a ligule. It's going to be broadleaf signal grass. If it doesn't have a ligule, like this doesn't, it's jungle rice or barnyard grass. And there's a chance, fair chance, glyphosate won't control it. It's going to control broadleaf signal grass. There's 15% of the population of jungle rice out there is glyphosate resistant, so it won't get it. So that's something to keep in mind. Some folks get a little confused because these grasses will grow differently depending on their neighbors. So if they got a lot of neighbors around them, they're going to grow more upright. If they don't, they'll be flat on the ground. And a lot of folks think, well, goosegrass grows flat on the ground, and it typically does. But jungle rice will too, if it doesn't have a lot of neighbors real close. So that's something to look for. Again, look at the red base. See it growing flat on the ground like that, and with the red base, it's probably going to be jungle rice or barnyard grass. If it's white base, instead of a red, if it's white there, it's more likely goosegrass. One of the key giveaways for jungle rice, distinguish it from basically all the other grasses, including its close cousin barnyard grass, is does it have the purple line on the leaf or the chevron? It's pretty distinct to this species. It's kind of pretty to look at, but you'll see these purple lines that'll grow here, that'll be on these leaves of the smaller seedlings. This is a dead giveaway you have jungle rice. Now, the one caveat here is jungle rice will often have this purple stripe when it's little, but not always. so like about a lot of things when trying to distinguish these grasses, it's not always. It's sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It depends, I guess, on genetics and growing environment. It can be a problem in corn. We do get calls on them in corn. Again, a lot of times with these jungle rice populations, barnyard grass populations, in corn and even in soybeans, they grow low to the ground, and you really don't see them until it's too late. They've already competed by the time they're poking up their heads through the canopy, particularly in soybean, and it even happens in corn. And corn can disguise big patches of grasses out there you won't see until you run the combine through the field, and then you guys, oh my gosh, I've lost some significant yield here due to all this grass competition. But we do see it as a problem in corn, particularly you start getting more to the river bottoms in Tipton County, Shelby, Lauderdale. That's where I've seen the most problems of jungle rice and barnyard grass in corn. Barnyard grass is going to be a taller, more aggressive grass than jungle rice. That's another way to tell them apart. It will typically get up they're near waist high. Jungle rice usually doesn't get much more than knee high when you look at them. Okay, now we're going to switch gears in goosegrass. This is another glyphosate-resistant grass we have out there that's increasingly becoming an issue. It was probably my #1 call this year, was goosegrass. Folks scrambling, trying to control it. But one of the dead giveaways is look at the white crown. Remember, jungle rice and barnyard grass had a red crown when it's small. Goosegrass will have a white crown. The other thing is a very, very flat stem. That's another giveaway that you got goosegrass. As it grows and gets bigger, it can really become an issue in a lot of crops, again, because a good bit of it now, probably 20% of it, or maybe closer to 30, is glyphosate resistant in the state. Large crabgrass, and this one Roundup will control still, so it's good to know you have it. It can have more of a purplish base at times, but it has lots of hair on it and a very membranous ligula. Jungle rice, barnyard grass won't have any hair on it to speak of, and won't have a ligula at all. Broadleaf signal grass is another common one out there. Again, I mentioned it has a red stem, just like jungle rice, but it does have a hairy ligule. So you'll see hairs on the ligule. And a lot of times, especially when it gets a little bit bigger, you'll see a bend at each node. That's a real distinct characteristic. And the other thing, I've got a picture of it here. No, I don't have a picture of it here. Is on the left-hand margin, the leaf will have a wavy margin to it instead of being real smooth. I have a real good picture of it here. That's another one to look as far as these grasses go. So I guess, I don't know, any questions on some of this grass ID? Okay, I'm just going to touch on a couple other things because we are getting to that time of year when we're looking at harvest dates in corn and even maybe spraying after corn harvest. Talked to several growers just this week talking about running spraying after corn harvest, trying to knock some of these weeds down so that keep the soil seed bank down of these weeds. Paraquat's a very effective option here after the corn harvest is run through the field. That quart rate of like the Gramoxone Ention would work well. There is the new Paraquats out now. Even there's a new Gramoxone out now that's a higher pound formulation. You only need about 24 ounces to get pretty good control after harvest. But even before harvest, trying to knock some weeds down, we've got 4 options in corn to consider. AIM would be one of the cheaper options out there and can be very, very effective on vines. The going rate is 1 to 2 ounces per acre, and you can run the combine, within a week of it. So that would be one decent option. It's not very good on pigweed, so if you're trying to dry down pigweed because it's an issue, it's just not going to be as good as say paraquat will be. But it's a very cheap, effective issue for vines. And we often have a lot of vines that out now really start to get their feet under them with light hitting the ground, and can really grow up and be a mess in our corn and can make it very hard to harvest. So a shot of AIM over the top can be a very effective option to drying them down. I probably want to get out there about now to start doing it and give it a couple weeks, to kind of kill it, start getting it dried down so they break apart more easy when the corn when you start running for corn harvest. Another very effective option that's very broad spectrum is Paraquat. It would be a good option. 32 ounces of the old 2-pound Gramoxone, 24 ounces of the newer stuff. You need to spray it at least 7 days prior to harvest. And like a lot of my research here on the station, because it's such a mess, we've got a lot of grown up messes, it's what I go to. And it's excellent drying down palmer amaranth, the vines, even grasses. So overall, this would be one of the more effective options, but you need to at least give it 7 days ahead of intended harvest. Some other options out there would be glyphosate. You can go from 22 to 44 ounces. Now, this would be more of a target. It would help on morning glories pretty good in a lot of cases, especially at that higher rate, that 44-ounce rate. But grasses would be one of the key things to go to with glyphosate. It's not going to help us at all, of course, on pigweed. Or probably Johnson grass in a lot of our fields now, but it would do a pretty decent job on a lot of the other grasses out there. And one of the things to watch, and Angela was just pointing out black layer. You want to make sure you got a black layer. And she showed how to very effectively demonstrated how to look for a black layer. But you do need to look for that before you go out and spray glyphosate. Make sure it's done, because once you spray glyphosate, it's done as far as filling goes. Another one is sodium chlorate. Goes out at a pretty high rate if you're using that 5-pound default, but it'd be another decent option that's usually pretty cheap and can be fairly effective on a broad spectrum. So with that, any questions, comments?
Well, If not, thank you, Larry.
Thank
And,
y'all.